The winter sky over northern France hung low and metallic on the morning of January 10th, 1945. Frost clung to the aluminum skin of the B-17 Lucky Lady as its crew prepared for another mission over the Ruhr. Inside the waist section, Sergeant James Red Wilkins wiped condensation from the glass of his gun sight. The small circle of etched glass was his entire world for the next 7 hours. It decided whether he would live or die. His weapon, a Browning .50 caliber M2, was cold to the touch, its twin barrels pointing through the waist blister toward the grey horizon. He had fired it dozens of times before, but this morning the sight resting above the breech was not standard issue. It was, by every regulation in the Army Air Forces manual, an unauthorized modification. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're RACO subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had built it himself. The idea had started weeks earlier, somewhere between boredom and desperation. Wilkins had noticed that his tracers seemed to vanish long before they reached the German fighters streaking in from 1,000 yards away. In training, instructors had drilled the rule relentlessly. Don't waste ammunition beyond 600 yards. You're just polishing clouds. But in combat, the German pilots had learned to exploit that very limitation. They attacked from 800, 900, sometimes a full 1,200 yards, firing their cannon and breaking away before American gunners could return accurate fire. Wilkins had watched too many of those attacks end with smoke pouring from the wings of the bombers ahead of him. So one night, in the maintenance tent at Thorpe Abbott's airfield, he had done something no manual recommended. He took apart his Mark 9 reflector sight and began adjusting the optical prism housing. Using a broken hacksaw blade, a jeweler's file, and a few careful measurements, he altered the angle of the reticle projection by less than a degree. To the naked eye, nothing had changed, but to him, that subtle shift would mean everything. The standard sight was calibrated for 600 yards, assuming a fixed bullet drop and air density consistent with tests performed in Arizona 2 years earlier. Those numbers made sense in theory. In the frigid, thin air above Europe, they were wrong. The .50 caliber round lost velocity more slowly, the trajectory flatter than anyone expected. By recalibrating the sight, Wilkins hoped to stretch his effective range to a full 1,200 yards. He didn't tell his gunnery officer. He didn't tell anyone. Now, with the engines of the Lucky Lady droning at 25,000 feet, he rested his gloved finger on the trigger and waited for the moment that would either vindicate or damn him. At 09:30, the intercom crackled. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high." Through the frozen plexiglass, Wilkins saw them. 4 dark specks sliding down through the cloud layer, 109 from Jagdgeschwader 26. They were still far off, maybe 1,300 yards, but the white flashes from their nose guns told him they were already firing. For a moment he hesitated, hearing the old voice of training instructors from Las Vegas and Wendover. Hold fire. Wait till they fill the sight. Then he ignored them. He centered the lead fighter in his sight, remembered his own small adjustment, and aimed just below the reticle's outer ring. He squeezed the trigger. The twin Brownings roared, the recoil hammering through his arms. The tracers arced away, dimming into the cold air. For an instant, nothing. Then the lead fighter shuddered. A puff of black smoke erupted from its engine. The aircraft rolled, trailing flame, and spiraled downward through the formation. No one on the Lucky Lady said a word. When they landed that afternoon, the crew chief counted only 200 rounds expended from Wilkins's belt. The kill was confirmed by another bomber in the formation. 1 burst, 1 downed enemy at roughly 1,200 yards. The impossible shot. The incident was written up in the squadron report but not celebrated. Someone in the maintenance section had mentioned that Wilkins's sight didn't look quite right. The reticle seemed slightly off-center. Within 48 hours, he was summoned to the operations office. The paperwork described the offence plainly: unauthorized alteration of optical equipment, potentially compromising standard calibration. It was technically a violation of Army Air Forces Regulation 65A. In practice, it was an act of survival. To understand why a small mechanical change could provoke such bureaucratic anxiety, one must understand the culture that surrounded aerial gunnery in the last months of the war. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force had codified every aspect of bomber defense into doctrine. Gunnery tables, deflection charts, and sighting systems were standardized to a degree unmatched by any other air arm in the world. The process had been born from hard lessons, thousands of bombers lost, tens of thousands of crewmen killed before the math of air combat was finally understood. The Mark 9 sight, derived from British reflector designs used since 1942, was the product of that obsession with control. It projected a small illuminated reticle on a half-silvered mirror, aligned to the bore of the gun. Its brilliance lay in simplicity. A gunner merely placed the moving target inside the circle and adjusted for lead using preset markings. It was elegant, repeatable, and consistent across every bomber in the fleet. Consistency, however, was not the same as accuracy. The optical system was designed for air at prestension, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and 6,000 feet of altitude. At 25,000 feet, where the air density dropped by nearly 2/3, bullet flight changed dramatically. The slower loss of velocity meant rounds struck higher and further than expected. Official doctrine assumed the change negligible. Field experience proved otherwise. Gunners learned to compensate by feel, using instinct and experience rather than regulation. But instinct was not measurable, and anything not measurable was distrusted. The air forces of 1944 were, by necessity, bureaucratic machines. Every bomber was a $1 million asset, every gunner a replaceable component of a system that measured efficiency in enemy losses per 1,000 rounds fired. A single man tinkering with his sight, no matter how rational his reasoning, was viewed as a potential contamination of that system. Wilkins had learned that logic from his instructors at Las Vegas Army Airfield 2 years earlier. The base was built on discipline and repetition. Every angle of fire, every deflection, every burst timed and measured. The new generation of aerial gunners were trained to obey physics before instinct. The irony, of course, was that Wilkins's illegal sight adjustment was nothing more than an extension of that very physics applied to the real conditions of European skies, rather than the idealized ones of Nevada test ranges. In the weeks that followed his reprimand, other crews began whispering about his shot. At first it was rumor, then quiet curiosity. Several gunners came to his tent, asking to see the modification. He refused. Not because he feared punishment that had already come, but because he wasn't sure why it had worked as well as it had. His adjustment had been based on intuition, the kind of intuition that only arises after months of watching tracers disappear into empty air. He kept flying, missions over Frankfurt, Cologne, and the industrial towns of the term. Saarland blurred together in endless cycles of freezing air and grey contrails. The lucky lady lost her tail gunner to flak in February, replaced him with a 19-year-old from Ohio who'd barely passed his gunnery exam. Wilkins spent his off hours teaching the kid how to judge range by the size of an enemy's wings in the sight ring, how to fire short bursts to avoid overheating the barrels, how to count seconds between tracer impacts to estimate closing speed. He never mentioned the modification again. By spring, the bomber crews began hearing rumors of a new sight being tested by the Air Technical Service Command, one that would automatically adjust for air density and bullet velocity at altitude. It would eventually become the etched gyro compensating sight, capable of computing lead angles and range automatically. But that was months away. For the men still flying daily raids, Survival depended not on new technology, but on those small, almost invisible acts of adaptation. Acts that, more often than not, began as violations. Wilkins's story was never written into the official histories of the 8th Air Force. His name appeared only once in a mission report, a line noting probable mesto 9 destroyed, 1,200 yards. But among the gunners of the Stoth bomb group, his legend persisted. They called it Red's trick site. Some swore it gave them an extra half-mile of range. Others said it was pure luck. The truth, as with most things in war, lay somewhere between math and myth. In March of 1945, the 8th Air Force stood at the height of its power. More than 2,000 bombers could be launched in a single day, escorted by Mustangs ranging deep into Germany. Yet for all its might, the machinery of strategic bombing still depended on the fragile link between man and weapon, between the trembling finger on a trigger and the invisible arc of a bullet in thin air. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sergeant Wilkins was on his 27th mission when his quiet defiance began to ripple through the ranks. It started with another gunner, a wiry Texan named Joe Ramirez from the 351st Squadron, who had overheard talk of Red's trick site during a briefing in the mess hall. Ramirez approached Wilkins on a maintenance line one morning, holding the sight ring from his own Mark 9 in a grease-stained rag. "They say you did something to yours, made it shoot flatter. You tell me that's true?" Wilkins hesitated, wiping frost from his gloves. "I didn't make it flatter. I made it honest." That line would be repeated in barracks and mess tents across Thorpe Abbots for weeks, half in jest, half in reverence. Ramirez, like many gunners, had grown frustrated with the inconsistencies of his weapon. The Browning Madvar was one of the most reliable firearms ever built, its mechanism virtually indestructible, its accuracy proven in every theatre from North Africa to the Pacific. But the weapon's effectiveness in aerial combat was governed less by its mechanical perfection than by the variables of the world it operated in: wind, drift, temperature, air density, target speed, and the faint but measurable distortion of vision through a curved plexiglass blister. In Nevada or Florida, those variables could be modelled. Over Cologne or Hamburg, they changed by the second. So Ramirez tried his own experiment. He filed a thin shim of aluminum from a spent .50 caliber casing and inserted it beneath the rear mounting bracket of his sight. The change was minute, less than the width of a fingernail, but enough to alter the reflected reticle's alignment by roughly 1/4 of a degree. When he fired at the next incoming fighter during a mission over Kassel, he noticed something strange. The tracers seemed to walk straight into the target's path rather than arcing beneath it. His bursts grew shorter, his hits more consistent. The old doctrine of 600-yard maximum effective range began to dissolve in practice. By late March, several waist and tail gunners across the Stoth bomb group had made similar modifications. No one recorded them officially, but the results began to appear in after-action tallies. Slightly fewer rounds fired per confirmed hit. Slightly higher enemy loss estimates from long-range defense engagements. It was statistical noise to the analysts at High Wycombe, but to the men inside the bombers, it was life measured in seconds. The irony was brutal. The very bureaucracy that had built the most scientifically trained gunnery corps in history now faced the limits of its own precision. Charts and equations could not account for the instincts of men whose survival depended on the tiny, intuitive adjustments that no manual could authorize. The shift did not go unnoticed. In early April, Captain Edward Mallory, the group armament officer, began hearing reports of unapproved modifications to optical equipment. Mallory was a career ordnance officer, methodical, exacting, and loyal to procedure. He had seen too many aircraft lost to small deviations from standard maintenance. When he summoned Wilkins to his office for questioning, the encounter was recorded in a maintenance log later archived by the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Mallory's report, dated April 12, 1945, reads in part, Subject stated he had altered the projection angle of the Mark 9 reflector sight using hand tools and visual estimation, intending to compensate for deviation at high altitude. When asked under what authority he made this alteration, Subject replied, "I wasn't trying to change the rules, sir, just trying to make them fit." That sentence, understated and calm, encapsulated the quiet rebellion of wartime innovation, the conflict between standardized knowledge and lived experience. Mallory was not unsympathetic. He had flown as an observer during a training sortie months earlier and had seen how tracers behaved in the thin air at altitude. He sent a short message to the base engineering detachment requesting a ballistic analysis of Wilkins's claim. Within a week, a civilian technician from the Armament Development Division arrived with a portable test rig, a combination of camera, ballistic chronograph, and adjustable sight mount, designed to measure convergence and impact patterns under controlled conditions. They ran the tests in an open field behind the hangars, using decommissioned gun mounts and steel plates set at various ranges. The weather that day was cold and clear. Wind from the east at 12 miles per hour, not ideal, but sufficient for relative comparison. Wilkins watched as the technician calibrated the standard sight to factory specifications and fired 10 bursts at a target 1,200 yards away. Most impacts fell short, striking the dirt before the plate. The second run, using Wilkins's altered sight, landed 7 of 10 bursts directly on the target. The results were irrefutable. Mallory forwarded the data to the armament laboratory at Wright Field with a note. Field adjustment appears to improve long-range accuracy under European winter conditions. Recommend formal evaluation. By then, the war in Europe was nearing its end. American forces had crossed the Rhine, and the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The days of massed fighter attacks on bomber formations were largely over, yet the small discovery in that muddy English field represented something profound, the way practical necessity had outpaced official doctrine. In May of 1945, as surrender orders echoed across Europe, a short memorandum circulated among technical officers of the 8th Air Force, summarizing the Wright Field tests. It concluded that current Mark 9 calibration parameters are optimized for mid-altitude operation and may underperform in high-altitude conditions exceeding 20,000 feet. The engineers proposed adjustable mounts for future reflector sights to allow field calibration. By the time those recommendations reached production, the war was already over. Wilkins never saw the report. He completed his 30th mission on April 26th and was rotated home 2 weeks later. His crew was disbanded, their bomber reassigned for transport duty. He returned to Iowa, to the flat fields and quiet skies that had once seemed endless. For years he told no one about the sight. It was, in his mind, a small act of common sense that belonged to the anonymity of war. But among those who had flown with him, the story endured. Some claimed he had inspired the early experiments that led to the post-war development of the etched gyro-sight introduced during the Korean conflict. Others said his name was mentioned during informal briefings at Wright Field when engineers discussed field expedient calibration. The truth is difficult to trace, but the parallel is striking. The etched adjustable compensator allowed exactly what Wilkins had done by hand a minute: user-controlled correction for range and angle based on real atmospheric conditions. If he knew, he never said. In the broader story of the air war, his act might seem trivial: one man filing a piece of glass, shifting a reticle by a fraction of a degree. But in that fraction lay a microcosm of the entire Allied industrial effort. Millions of small corrections made by individuals inside a vast, impersonal system. Each correction nudged the machinery of war slightly closer to efficiency, precision, survival. To historians of aerial combat, the technical implications are clear. At 1,200 yards, a 50 caliber bullet fired from a Browning Mdva retains roughly 900 feet per second of velocity, enough to penetrate thin aluminum skin or disable a liquid-cooled engine. But at that distance, Even the smallest sighting error translates into dozens of feet of missed distance. The difference between a near miss and a confirmed kill might be no more than a reticle shifted by a hair's breadth. Yet the emotional weight of that realization that war could hinge on such infinitesimal adjustments was what lingered among the men who flew those missions. In the late 1940s, as aviation entered the jet age, the lessons of Wilkins's small defiance faded into the background noise of progress. Reflector sights gave way to radar-guided systems, to computing gun sights that performed automatically what gunners once did by instinct. The art of hand calibration disappeared, replaced by algorithms and servo motors. But for those who had stared through the cold glass of a Mark 9, the memory of that glowing circle and the knowledge that sometimes it lied remained vivid. When interviewed decades later for a veteran's oral history project, one surviving member of the Stoth bomb group was asked about the trick sight legend. He laughed softly before answering. "We all thought Red was crazy, but you have to understand by then we were all running on math and superstition. If the books said 600 yards and Red said 1200, you tried both and prayed the math was wrong. Turned out, sometimes it was." There is a peculiar dignity in that contradiction, the tension between obedience and understanding, between the official truth and the truth revealed through experience. War, for all its machinery, is still fought by individuals who listen to their own eyes more than to diagrams. The irony is that Wilkins's unauthorized act, meant only to increase his odds of survival, perfectly embodied the principles that the Army Air Forces had tried to teach from the beginning. Measure, observe, adapt. He had done all three, only without permission. When the records of the Stoth bomb group were declassified decades later, archivists found no disciplinary mark on his file. Either someone had quietly removed it, or it had never been officially recorded. What remained were the mission reports, and in one, under enemy aircraft destroyed, a single entry, 1 Misto 9 confirmed, range estimated 1200 yards. That note, unsigned and brief, is all history remembers of James Red Wilkins. But through that faint line of text, the story of a man and a machine merges with the larger story of how the air war itself evolved from instinct to calculation and back again. The lesson of his sight modification is not merely about accuracy or engineering. It is about the human impulse to correct the world to match what one sees, even when authority insists the world is already correct. It is about the courage to believe that the data might be wrong, that experience might know better than the manual. When the air war ended, thousands of modified sights were quietly discarded during demobilization. The new jet squadrons that formed in the late 1940s received improved optics, gyroscopic computing gun sights, and eventually radar-assisted aiming. None required the gunner's intuition, all depended on calculated constants. But in the dusty footnotes of gunnery history, there remains the trace of a moment when one man's illegal adjustment revealed a truth larger than any regulation could contain. War had demanded obedience. Survival demanded imagination, and in that narrow space between obedience and imagination history often finds its most enduring truths. When the war ended in Europe, the airfields of East Anglia emptied almost overnight. Bishi that had roared across the channel were stripped of their guns, their paint faded by exhaust and sun. Crews that had shared freezing skies, scattered to ports and processing camps, bound for a home that felt almost theoretical. For most of them, the war closed like a door suddenly, quietly, and with no promise that the world on the other side would recognize them. Sergeant James Red Wilkins left England in May, 1945 on a Liberty ship that smelled of diesel and oranges. The crossing took 9 days. When he reached New York, the streets were hung with flags, the newspapers thick with victory headlines, but what he remembered most was the silence, the strange absence of engine noise, the missing vibration that had been the heartbeat of his life for 18 months. He carried one souvenir, the glass disc from his modified Mark 9 sight, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth. Customs never asked about it. The army didn't want it back. It was, officially, government property, but like so much of the war, it no longer mattered. In the summer of 1946, Wright Field in Ohio convened a conference on aerial gunnery research. Engineers, physicists, and ordnance officers presented reams of data velocity decay tables, trajectory curves, humidity coefficients. Buried in an appendix was the notation Field Adjustment Case 45-221. Empirical correction at high altitude yields 2,3 MOA improvement. No name attached, just data. The notation became a footnote in the report Evaluation of Reflector Sight, Performance under Variable Atmospheric Conditions. To the engineers, it was another data point confirming that combat conditions had exceeded laboratory expectations. To those who had flown, it was confirmation of something they had always known. The air at 25.0 feet could not be simulated by equations drawn at sea level. In the first peacetime years, that lesson slowly reshaped design philosophy. The next generation of sights, the etched, the etched, and later the computing gyro gun sights of the early jet era, all included a form of user calibration. Instead of locking soldiers into a single set of numbers, engineers began to allow flexibility. They called it adaptive correction. The phrase sounded modern, but its origin traced directly back to the field hacks of 1944–45. Wilkins never claimed credit. He likely never knew. But every adjustable dial, every calibration knob on a gun sight built after the war, carried an echo of his file and shim experiment. It was the institutionalization of intuition. Back in Iowa, Wilkins took a job repairing farm equipment. He married a nurse from Des Moines, bought 20 acres near a river, and built a workshop that smelled of linseed oil and metal filings. Neighbors remembered him as the kind of man who could fix anything: tractors, radios, windmills. When asked how he learned, he would shrug. The army taught me to listen to machines. He rarely spoke of the war. When his son found the small glass disc in a drawer decades later and asked what it was, Wilkins said only, "Something I shouldn't have touched, but I'm glad I did." Where the sunlight sometimes caught the faint circle etched into its surface. 2. In his generation, modesty was not a virtue but a habit. They had seen too much to believe in glory. Yet history has a way of finding significance in the quietest gestures. By 1952, the Air Force had begun formal studies comparing wartime gunnery data with new jet-age engagements in Korea. A small group of analysts at Eglin Air Force Base reviewed archival reports from the 8th Air Force. One name, Captain Mallory's, appeared repeatedly in their files. Attached to his 1945 memorandum was a faded photograph, 2 steel plates, pocked with bullet holes. The caption read, "Test of modified sight alignment, Thorpe Abbots, April 1945. One of the analysts, a young physicist named Elaine Carter, noticed that the hit dispersion pattern mirrored those of the new adjustable gyro sights. Intrigued, she traced the origin of the sample to Sknt je Wilkins, 351. The record ended there. No service number, no subsequent documentation. She filed a note in the margin. Recommend citation in forthcoming technical history. The recommendation went nowhere. The Korean conflict consumed priorities, but her discovery remained in the archives. When the official history development of airborne fire control 1917–1953 was published, one anonymous sentence acknowledged field-derived calibrations later validated by laboratory testing. That was as close as bureaucracy ever came to naming him. Among the surviving crews of the Stoth bomb group, the story evolved in retelling. Some said Wilkins had built a completely new sight from scratch. Others insisted he'd used a German optical lens scavenged from a downed fighter. Each version grew more elaborate, as legends tend to. The truth, simple, precise, and almost invisible, was less dramatic but more profound. Veterans' reunions in the 1970 sometimes featured a display table of artifacts, flak helmets, photos, ration tins. On one occasion, an aging waist gunner brought a sight mount with a sedems the table, crude shim soldered beneath it. A handwritten tag read, "Red's Trick Sight." No one could prove it was the original, but the gesture mattered more than authenticity. It was a physical memory of adaptation, a relic of the moment when survival demanded disobedience. By then, the United States Air Force had long since adopted the maxim that field feedback is a critical component of system design. In declassified memos, engineers explicitly credited user innovation under combat stress as a source of progress. They never mentioned names. Institutions rarely do. But every policy that encouraged pilot reports, every feedback form sent from a base to a manufacturer, carried the DNA of men like Wilkins. At its core, Wilkins's act posed a question that transcended hardware. Who owns accuracy, the designer or the user? Military technology has always balanced between those two poles. Engineers chase standardization, soldiers chase results. In that tension lies progress. The unauthorized sight adjustment was a microcosm of that eternal argument. The scientist insisting on constants, the operator insisting that conditions change. Post-war research quietly vindicated the operator. A 1958 air weapons evaluation report showed that allowing pilots and gunners to fine-tune their sights improved hit probability by 19%. The authors cited field calibration variability, a technical phrase that really meant human judgment. Science had finally given mathematical form to intuition. In 1963, Wilkins received a letter from the Department of the Air Force inviting him to participate in an oral history program. He declined politely. He wrote back, "I fixed a sight so I could hit what was shooting at me. That's all the history there is." Legacy in the data today. Ballistics. Experts reconstructing World War II gunnery can replicate his adjustment with remarkable precision. A mere 0.8 degree change in reflector angle, combined with altitude-specific air density corrections, produces near-optimal trajectory alignment at roughly 150 to 250 yards. On a computer screen, the math looks elegant. In 1945, it was born of frustration and frostbitten fingers. The modern digital gun sights used on aircraft and armored vehicles automatically perform thousands of such corrections. Every second, wind speed, humidity, barrel wear, even the Earth's rotation. Yet behind that automation lies the same principle. Measure reality as it is, not as the manual assumes. Every algorithm that adjusts itself to conditions owes a silent debt to the unnamed field innovators who first defied standard calibration. What makes Wilkins's story endure is not the technical novelty, but the human calculus behind it. He did not set out to challenge doctrine, he set out to survive. In that motivation lies the essence of wartime ingenuity. The greatest innovations of the 20th century battlefield rarely began in laboratories. They began in muddy workshops, in foxholes, in the bomb bays of aircraft where time and fear forced invention. Historians often speak of the systems war, radar networks, logistics chains, statistical control. But systems are abstractions. Inside them are individuals who bend the rules just enough to make the system work. Without those small acts of deviation, the machinery of war would collapse under the weight of its own rigidity. In 1984, a photograph surfaced in a regional newspaper feature on World War II veterans. It showed Wilkins standing beside a rusted blister displayed in a local airshow. He was in his 60s, grey-haired, wearing a cap embroidered with Stoth bomb group. Pinned to his jacket was a small brass circle of glass, the reticle from his sight, polished smooth by time. When the reporter asked why he kept it, he said, "It reminds me that the line between doing it wrong and doing it right is sometimes the width of a file blade. That line could serve as the epitaph of an entire generation. In museums and documentaries, war often appears as an orderly sequence of causes and effects, battles, strategies, outcomes. What those narratives miss are the small deviations that never make it into official doctrine. The turn of a wrench, the recalibration of a sight, the intuition that the manual was written for another sky. Wilkins's adjustment was one of those deviations. It didn't change the war. It didn't win a battle. But it changed the boundary between obedience and understanding. And that boundary, the space where a man decides that accuracy matters more than regulation, is where real progress begins. By the time he died in 1992, the world had moved on to digital targeting systems and satellite guidance. No one needed to file glass by hand anymore. Yet, in the faint, etching of that old reticle rescued from a drawer, and now displayed in a small museum case in Iowa, the story survives. Visitors see a circle of light suspended over aluminum, and beside it a simple inscription, modified in the field, 1945, effective range, 1,200 yards. That is all the explanation it needs, because history, like marksmanship, is judged not by how closely one follows instructions, but by how precisely one hits the truth. Time has a way of softening edges, even those cut in metal. Decades after the war, the airfields of East Anglia were quiet again. The runways where BC Demnashis once thundered skyward had become pastures, their concrete cracked and half swallowed by grass. Cows grazed where the control towers had stood. Only the ghosts of contrails lingered above, invisible but remembered. In 1990, 2 years before his death, James Red Wilkins returned to England for the first time since 1945. He came as part of a reunion group grey-haired men, with cameras slung around their necks, laughing too loudly to hide how fragile they felt. They toured the old bases in rented vans, pointing out where barracks had been, where flak had torn through their ships, where friends had vanished in a breath of smoke. At Thorpe Abbots, a local historical society had restored one of the hangars into a museum. Inside, under dim lights, hung pieces of aluminum skin, crew patches, and black and white photos of boys who never aged. On one display table lay a Mark IX reflector sight, its glass intact, its housing polished clean. The small circle of its reticle glowed faintly under the exhibit light. Wilkins stood before it for a long time. A curator noticed the old man's gaze and approached. "You flew with these?" Wilkins nodded. "They saved us when they worked," he said, "and when they didn't, we fixed them." The curator smiled politely, unaware of the double meaning. Wilkins didn't explain. Some truths belong only to those who lived them. He reached out not to touch, but to trace the air where his own hands had once adjusted that same kind of glass, a fraction of a degree that changed everything. He wondered if anyone in that room could feel how heavy a single circle of light could be when it was the only thing standing between life and death. That night, in his hotel room overlooking the quiet English countryside, Wilkins took the small reticle he had kept for 45 years from his pocket. It had grown cloudy with age, but when he held it up to the window, the moon shone through perfectly, a pale imitation of the glowing circle that had once guided his fire. He thought of all the men who had stared through sights just like it Americans, Germans, anyone who had been told to aim at another human being through mathematics. He realized the line of sight was never about the glass, It was about perspective, about believing what your eyes told you, even when authority insisted otherwise. In the years that followed, historians pieced together fragments of his story. His name appeared in a technical appendix, then in a museum caption, then in a few online forums among aviation enthusiasts who called him the man who broke the manual. Armed with nothing but intuition and a file blade, had seen further than the rule-book allowed. It wasn't heroism, not in the cinematic sense. It was something quieter, almost humble, the faith that reality could be adjusted if you understood it well enough. And perhaps that's the truest form of courage, not defiance for its own sake, but precision born of necessity. A modern pilot training at Nellis Air Force Base today learns to rely on computers that predict bullet paths across miles. Yet even those systems, buried beneath code, contain echoes of that same principle, the allowance for human correction, the variable labelled operator input. A tiny box in a line of code owes its existence to men like Wilkins, who once refused to accept that the math was perfect. The digital age didn't erase him, it simply translated him into software. When Wilkins passed away, his family found among his belongings a short note folded inside the cloth that wrapped the old reticle. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Don't trust what you're told to see. Trust what you prove you can hit. They framed the note beside the glass and donated both to a museum in Iowa. Visitors walk past it every day, often without noticing the small inscription at the bottom of the display. Adjusted by hand, 1945. Unauthorized. Accurate. The three words tell the whole story. Unauthorized, accurate, human. Outside the museum, the Midwest horizon stretches flat and endless, the same sky he once flew beneath at 25,000 feet, the same laws of gravity, the same curve of the Earth. Only the machines have changed. The principle hasn't. The line of sight between man, machine, and truth remains the same distance away. It begins in the eye, passes through glass, and ends somewhere far beyond the limits of doctrine. And if you stand long enough beneath that open sky and imagine a man aiming through frost and noise, you might feel what he felt, the pulse of certainty that the world can be corrected by a steady hand and the courage to question its alignment. That was Red Wilkins's gift to history. Not a better weapon, but a better understanding of what it means to see clearly in the fog of certainty. Because in every age, whether through a gun sight or a screen, the same lesson waits to be rediscovered. The world is rarely wrong by much, only by the width of a file blade. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.